Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, introductory course on wetlands and other surface waters, provided by the Florida Department of Transportation's or FDOT's Office of Environmental Management. This training is part of a series of introductory courses that provide guidance on FDOT's process for complying with NEPA, called Project Development and Environment, or PD&E. Please see the Environmental Management Academy course catalog in the FDOT Learning Curve or the Office of Environmental Management website, PD&E training track for other trainings in this series. Several of these trainings are referenced throughout this training. Please note, links to key references mentioned in this training will be provided on the last slide. The purpose of this course is to provide instruction on wetlands and other surface waters and how to document involvement on a project as described in Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual. Please note, you may pause this training at any time. This training will have 4 lessons. Lesson 1 will provide an overview of wetlands and other surface water basics. Lesson 2 will provide instruction on the evaluation and documentation of wetland and other surface water involvement. Lesson 3 will provide guidance on mitigation for unavoidable wetland impacts. And Lesson 4 will provide an overview of the wetland section of the different environmental documents. Guidance on wetlands and other surface waters is provided in Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through these lessons. This chapter is available on FDOT's Office of Environmental Management, or OEM's website, using the link at the bottom of the slide. This link can also connect you to other chapters of the PD&E Manual that are referenced throughout this training. Lesson 1 will provide an overview of wetlands and other surface water basics. This chapter includes the same terminology as provided in the definitions section of Part 1, Chapter 12, Environmental Permits. A wetland is a land area that is saturated with water, either permanently or seasonally, such that it takes on the characteristics of a distinct ecosystem. Wetlands may be tidal, such as salt marshes and mangroves, or non-tidal, such as freshwater marshes, swamps, and river floodplains. Wetlands are important for many reasons. They provide flood water storage and flood protection by trapping floodwaters and slowing the water flows. Slower water flows mean more time for percolation to recharge the groundwater and less erosion, which could impact water quality. Wetland vegetation and detritus act as water filters and improve water quality. Wetlands also provide essential habitat for fish and wildlife. According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, more than 1/3 of the United States' threatened and endangered species live only in wetlands, and nearly half use wetlands at some point in their lives. A surface water is any natural or artificial body of water, including the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, bays, bayous, sounds, estuaries, lagoons, lakes, ponds, impoundments, rivers, streams, springs, creeks, branches, sloughs, tributaries, canals, ditches, and other watercourses. Other surface water is a term used to encompass all jurisdictional surface waters while differentiating them from wetlands for water quality protection purposes. Surface waters are important because they provide important functions including flood protection, groundwater, recharge, and habitat for fish and wildlife. Since wetlands and other surface waters are so important, there are a number of regulations and policies in place to ensure the protection of these valuable resources. Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 established permit requirements to prevent unauthorized obstruction or alteration of any water of the United States. The regulation prohibits the construction of any facility as well as excavation, filling, or other modification to a water course within the waters of the U.S. without prior authorization from the Chief of Engineers and Secretary of War. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act authorizes the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, also known as the Corps, to require permits for the discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States. Basically, a permit must be obtained prior to discharging any material to waters of the U.S., and no permit will be issued unless it is shown that wetland impact avoidance, minimization, and compensation measures have been implemented. The Corps is the federal agency responsible for permitting wetland impacts with oversight by the EPA. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NIMS, serve in a commenting role to the Corps and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP, with respect to their jurisdictional responsibilities. In Florida, state authority over activities in surface waters and wetlands is administered by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP, and 5 water management districts. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission advises the FDEP and water management districts on wildlife issues as a requirement under Florida's Environmental Resource Permit Program. In 1977, Executive Order 11990, entitled Protection of Wetlands, was issued. This executive order establishes a national policy to avoid, to the extent possible, the long and short-term adverse impacts associated with the destruction or modification of wetlands, and to avoid direct or indirect support of new construction in wetlands, wherever there is a practical alternative. Under this order, federal agencies must consider alternatives that avoid wetlands and minimize impacts if an activity affecting a wetland cannot be avoided. The order applies to the acquisition, management, and disposal of federal lands and facilities federally undertaken, financed, or assisted construction and improvements, and federal activities and programs affecting land use, including but not limited to water and related land resources planning, regulating, and licensing activities. The order also stipulates that federal agencies shall not provide assistance for new construction within wetlands unless there is no practicable alternative and unless all practicable measures to minimize harm have been implemented. The U.S. Department of Transportation, or U.S. DOT, in implementing Executive Order 11990, set forth its policy on wetlands in U.S. DOT Order 5660.1a. Preservation of the nation's wetlands, which is to assure the protection, preservation, and enhancement of the nation's wetlands to the fullest extent practicable during the planning, construction, and operation of transportation facilities and projects. New construction in wetlands shall be avoided unless there is no practicable alternative to the construction, and the proposed action includes all practicable measures to minimize harm to wetlands which may result from such construction, and making a finding of no practicable alternative, economic, environmental, and other factors may be taken into account. Cost alone will not necessarily render alternatives or minimization measures impracticable, since additional costs would normally be recognized as necessary and justified to meet national wetland policy objectives. More guidance on practicable alternatives is provided in 40 U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Section 230.10a. The Federal Highway Administration's, or FHWA's, policy and procedures for the evaluation and mitigation of adverse environmental impacts to wetlands and natural habitat resulting from federal aid projects are contained in 23 CFR Part 777. FHWA's environmental policy statement provides that FHWA will participate to the fullest extent permitted by law in funding mitigation and enhancement activities required by federal, state, and local statutes and regulations for project-related impact to the natural environment, neighborhoods, and communities. FHWA will fund the appropriate compensatory mitigation for unavoidable impacts after it has been determined that no action and the avoidance alternatives are not practical. All funding for environmental mitigation must be based on scientifically valid analysis and must show documented support of how the cost was derived to mitigate the adverse impact. In order for FHWA to participate in the funding of mitigation, the wetland analysis must meet the requirements of 23 CFR Part 777. There are many agencies involved with the implementation of the regulations and policies associated with wetland and other surface water protection. At the federal level, retained waters of the United States, wetlands, and other surface waters are regulated by the United States Army Corps of Engineers with support from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Marine Fisheries Service. In Florida, wetlands and other surface waters are regulated by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the Water Management Districts with support from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection has also assumed permitting authority under Section 404G of the Clean Water Act to authorize dredge and fill impacts to state-regulated waters, assumed waters. The following regulations are also related to wetlands. Title 33 CFR, Part 320, provides the general regulatory policies of the Corps. Section 320.4 requires a public interest review of all permit applications. Wetlands are one of the public interest factors identified for the public interest review. If a Section 404 permit is being pursued, the public interest factors relevant to each alternative should be evaluated and balanced. Relevant factors may include conservation, economics, aesthetics, wetlands, cultural values, navigation, fish and wildlife values, water supply, water quality, and any other factors judged important to the needs and welfare of the people. If the discharge that would be authorized by the permit is in compliance with the EPA's guidelines, the permit will be issued unless the Corps determines that the action would be contrary to public interest based on a review of the public interest factors. The Uniform Mitigation Assessment Method, or UMAM, detailed in Chapter 62 TAC 345, and FAC is the statewide method to determine the functional value provided by wetlands and other surface waters. For each project, FDOT must determine if wetlands are in the project area. For projects that do not qualify for Environmental Screening Tool or EST, screening during FDOT's efficient transportation decision-making process, a field visit, or desktop analysis using the EST's area of interest tool, or other mapping tools can be used to determine if a project will impact wetlands or other surface waters. This information can be documented in the Type 1 Categorical Exclusion Checklist or the Non-Major State Action Checklist as appropriate. For projects qualifying for EST screening, the district uses information from the Programming Screen Summary Report to determine the project's involvement with wetlands. The analyst should review the Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAT, comments made for the navigation in wetlands and surface waters issues and coordinate with appropriate district staff, such as environmental staff or the permits coordinator. It may also be helpful to review ETAT comments and other related issues such as coastal and marine, water resources, and in some cases protected species and habitat. Comments from agencies that regulate wetlands such as the Corps, FDEP, and the water management districts are especially important. The results of the screening can help the district identify the level of evaluation that may be needed, if permits may be necessary, and whether potential mitigation opportunities in the project area exist. The summary report may state specifically that a wetland evaluation is needed in the list of technical studies section. Other sections of the report may be useful, such as the general project recommendations and anticipated permits sections. At the beginning of the project development and environment or PD&E process, it is important to contact the commenting agencies to confirm the recommendations made during the EST screening events and to ensure wetland issues are addressed. Available site-specific data should be collected and reviewed, such as, but not limited to, Natural Resources Conservation Service soil surveys, wetland plant identification resources, FDOT Florida Land Use Cover Classification System called FLUX, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Wetland Inventory, United States Geological Survey topographic maps, and aerial photographs. All data sources must be documented in the Natural Resources Evaluation, include any pertinent maps identifying the wetlands in the project area. A field review should also be conducted to verify the data collected during the desktop analysis. A delineation of each wetland in the project area should be conducted in accordance with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual, Regional Supplement to the Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual, Atlantic and Gulf Coastal Plain Region. The Florida Wetlands Delineation Manual in Chapters 62 TAC 340, FAC, delineation of the landward extent of wetlands and surface waters as appropriate. Boundaries may be delineated with the aid of data sources previously discussed for wetland identification and or any other available data sources and be field verified. Maps of the delineated wetlands in the project area should be prepared for inclusion in the NRE and/or environmental document. The core Jacksonville District accepts a preliminary jurisdictional determination form. The district should contact the Corps to determine whether a preliminary form is appropriate for a project. Involvement with wetlands and other surface waters should be evaluated regardless of whether the project is required to meet NEPA or state requirements or qualifies for EST screening. Wetlands must be evaluated for any project that may have wetland impacts regardless of the class of action or whether the project is federally or state funded. A functional assessment is required for any wetlands that may be impacted. The functional assessment should be in accordance with the Unified Mitigation Assessment Method, or UMAM, stipulated by Chapter 6.2 TAC 345. FAC. Use the functional assessments to estimate the amount of wetland mitigation needed for the project, based on functional loss and the importance of the affected wetlands to the surrounding biological community. For large-scale projects, when UMAM is not practicable, the district should coordinate with the appropriate regulatory agency to determine if an alternate assessment or UMAM modification can be utilized for this project. If the district intends to advance permitting activities prior to design, a greater level of detail will be necessary. The functional assessment will be refined and finalized during permitting. In Lesson 2, we will discuss wetland involvement and wetland evaluation. FHWA issued Technical Advisory T6640.8A to fulfill the requirements of US DOT Order 5660.1A. FHWA's Technical Advisory provides guidance on the preparation of environmental documents, including the assessment of project impacts on wetlands. The advisory stipulates that the environmental document for an environmental impact statement, or EIS, or an environmental assessment called an EA, where wetland impacts may be significant, should identify the type, quality, and function of wetlands involved. The wetlands should be identified in accordance with 33 CFR 328.3b, which requires the presence of hydrophytic vegetation, hydric soils, and wetland hydrology. The direct and indirect wetland impacts, including the importance and the severity of the impacts, must be included in the environmental document. The evaluation of the importance of the wetland impact should consider the primary functions of the wetland, such as flood control, wildlife habitat, and groundwater recharge. The relative importance of these functions to the total wetland resource of the area, and any other factors such as a uniqueness that may contribute to the wetland's importance. The analysis of the impact severity should include the project's effects on the stability and quality of the wetlands, as well as the short and long-term effects on the wetlands and the importance of any loss. If the project includes multiple alternatives, the environmental document must include an evaluation of alternatives which would avoid wetland impacts and identify practicable measures to minimize wetland impacts. During the planning phase, wetland information is included in the Preliminary Environmental Discussion, or PED, section of the Advanced Notification Fact Sheet, and includes the district's initial identification of potential involvement with wetland resources within the project. The PED should also identify the location of potential jurisdictional wetlands as defined by FDEP, Water Management District, and/or the Corps, and provide a description of how the wetlands will be evaluated in the PD&E study. The fact sheet may also include a list of permits that may be required and a list of technical studies that may be needed. The advanced notification must not draw any conclusions regarding the significance of the wetland involvement, since this would constitute a wetlands finding. Part 1, Chapter 3 of the PD&E Manual provides further information regarding the advanced notification and preliminary environmental discussion, as well as the computer-based NEPA introductory course, Preliminary Environmental Discussion and Advanced Notification. The Natural Resources Evaluation, or NRE, is an FDOT technical report prepared during the PD&E study that documents protected species and habitat, wetlands and other surface waters, and essential fish habitat issues and analysis. The NRE is used to supplement the environmental document and assess impacts in detail. The wetland evaluations and impact analysis conducted during the PD&E phase are detailed in the wetland evaluation section of the NRE. The district should consider commentary from the ETAT with wetland jurisdictional responsibility when preparing the NRE. For more information regarding how to prepare an NRE, please refer to OEM's Natural Resources Evaluation Guidance document. The wetland evaluation section of the NRE should include a brief introduction with applicable laws and agencies with jurisdiction, a discussion of the methodology used for wetland determination, and the following other elements. 1. The identification of existing wetlands and other surface waters within the project area. 2. Maps showing the locations of the wetlands and other surface waters in the project area should be included. 3. A delineation of each wetland. 4. A description of wetlands in the project area according to the Florida Land Use Cover and Forms classification system called FLUX and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service classification system as described in Classification of Wetlands and Deep Water Habitats of the United States. 5. An evaluation of the potential direct and indirect effects the project will have on the wetland. Wetland impacts regulated under Florida's Environmental Resource Permit or ERP program, the Corps' Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, or the state Section 404 program need to be identified and evaluated. 6. A discussion of the proposed project's potential contribution to cumulative impacts on the identified wetlands. 7. A discussion of practical measures to minimize harm to wetlands and other surface waters. Minimization could involve measures included in FDOT's standard specifications for road and bridge construction, such as the installation of temporary turf, rolled erosion control products, sediment barriers, inlet protection systems, and other erosion and sediment control devices to minimize impacts to wetlands in the project area. 8. A functional assessment of the wetlands in accordance with UMAM. 9. And finally, a discussion of the potential mitigation options available and description of how these options can be incorporated into the project. Should the agencies request additional information to be able to complete consultation or coordination, responses should be provided in an NRE addendum. An NRE should be only revised should agency comments be so substantial that an addendum would not suffice to address the comments. Please note that a technical memo may be prepared for projects where minimal wetland impacts may be authorized under a core nationwide permit, a state general 404 permit, or FDEP or Water Management District ERP. Refer to OEM's Natural Resources Evaluation Guidance document for more details regarding the preparation of a tech memo. For federal projects, the district must submit the draft NRE to the Office of Environmental Management for review prior to submitting the final NRE to the appropriate agencies for coordination or consultation. A summary of the NRE and the results of agency coordination consultation should be included in the environmental document. The NRE should be retained in the project file, and it is recommended that it be placed within the NRE folder within the statewide environmental project tracker called SWAP. In Lesson 3, we will discuss mitigation for unavoidable wetland impacts. In Title 40 CFR, Section 150.1s, the Council on Environmental Quality requires consideration of mitigation measures in the development of project alternatives. These mitigation measures are: 1. Avoiding the impact altogether by not taking a certain action or parts of an action. 2. Minimizing impacts by limiting the degree or magnitude of the action and its implementation. 3. Rectifying the impact by repairing, rehabilitating, or restoring the affected environment. 4. Reducing or eliminating the impact over time by preservation and maintenance operations during the life of the action. And 5. Compensating for the impact by replacing or providing substitute resources or environments. Avoidance, minimization, and compensation are to be employed in sequence. First, project impacts must be avoided to the extent practicable. Second, unavoidable impacts should be minimized. Third, remaining unavoidable impacts should be mitigated through compensatory actions. This ordered approach to mitigation is known as sequencing and involves understanding the affected environment and assessing transportation effects throughout project development. Effective mitigation starts at the beginning of PD&E not at the end. Mitigation must be included as an integral part of the alternatives development and analysis process. The U.S. DOT Order 5660.1A, Preservation of the Nation's Wetlands, provides similar guidance regarding avoidance and minimization strategies prior to the use of compensatory mitigation for unavoidable wetland impacts. This policy requires demonstration that there is no practicable alternative to the use of the wetlands and that all practicable measures to minimize harm to the wetlands has been included. While the lead agency has the authority to restore and enhance existing wetlands and to create new wetlands, these do not counterbalance the effects of adverse effects to wetlands which are avoidable or satisfy U.S. DOT policy for the protection, preservation, and enhancement of the nation's wetlands to the fullest extent practicable. When it is determined that there are unavoidable adverse impacts to wetlands, compensatory mitigation is required pursuant to 33 CFR Parts 325 and 332, 40 CFR Part 230, and Section 373.4137 Florida statutes. FHWA will fund the appropriate compensatory mitigation as per the Federal Highway Administration Environmental Policy Statement 1994. According to the statement, it is FHWA policy to fully participate in the cost of environmental mitigation for project impacts that are necessary to satisfy federal law while ensuring that mitigation necessitated by state law and all environmental enhancement measures represent a reasonable expenditure of highway funds. In order for FHWA to participate in the funding of mitigation, the wetland analysis must meet the requirements of the 23 CFR Part 777. As per Section 373.4137 of the Florida statutes, compensatory mitigation of wetland impacts resulting from FDOT projects will be funded by the Department of Transportation and be carried out by the use of mitigation banks and any other mitigation options that satisfy state and federal requirements. FDOT typically offsets wetland impacts at mitigation banks through funding of mitigation services by the water management districts or through in lieu fee mitigation. For those projects which cannot be mitigated through a permitted mitigation bank or water management district due to credit or site availability, respectively, FDOT will propose alternative mitigation. Alternative mitigation options include creation, restoration, enhancement, and/or preservation. As described in the Corps' final rule, compensatory mitigation for losses of aquatic resources 2008. Compensatory mitigation can be carried out through 4 methods: the restoration of a previously existing wetland or other aquatic site, the enhancement of an existing aquatic site's functions, the establishment or creation of a new aquatic site, or the preservation of an existing aquatic site. A conceptual mitigation plan for unavoidable wetland impacts is developed in the PD&E phase and refined during the permitting process. The conceptual mitigation plan should identify the amount of mitigation necessary to replace the loss of wetland functions as identified by UMAM or other functional assessment. It should also identify mitigation opportunities that FDOT will implement to offset adverse impacts, such as the purchase of mitigation credits from a permitted mitigation bank, payment to FDEP or a water management district for mitigation services, development of its own mitigation site, or any other option that meets state and federal requirements. Appropriate regulatory agency coordination regarding the conceptual mitigation plan is necessary. Early resolution of state and federal permit agencies' concerns and joint agreement on appropriate mitigation is promoted by OEM. Early agreements may substantially reduce delays during the permitting process and should be documented in the environmental document. FDOT documents compensatory mitigation for unavoidable impacts through discussion of mitigation options available and using the standard statement shown here in the environmental document. In Lesson 4, we learn how wetland involvement is documented in the environmental documents. A project may have wetland involvement regardless of the class of action or environmental document type. Any project that has potential wetland involvement requires a wetland evaluation regardless of whether it is a Type 1 categorical exclusion, Type 2 categorical exclusion, an environmental assessment, an environmental impact statement, or a state environmental impact report. However, the significance of any wetland impacts may affect the class of action for the project. Projects with more wetland impacts will have a higher class of action and will require more documentation than those with fewer impacts. Regardless of the class of action, the environmental document for a project with potential wetland involvement must include a summary of the wetland evaluation. The wetland summary must include the wetland identification and results of the wetland evaluation. The wetland summary should also include, as applicable to the project, a comparison of wetland impacts by alternative, proposed mitigation, the mitigation standard statement, any wetland commitments, and documentation of any agency coordination. A formal wetlands finding is required for Type 2 categorical exclusions, an EA with a finding of no significant impact or FONSI, and final environmental impact statement or FEIS. The location of the wetland summary with the document is dependent on the environmental document being prepared. For Type 1 categorical exclusions, the wetland summary is documented in the Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist. The wetland section of the Type 2 categorical exclusion determination form documents the wetland summary for Type 2 categorical exclusions. The wetland summary should be documented in the wetland section of the environmental analysis for both EAs and EISs. Please note, there are chapters in Part 1 of the PD&E manual as well as other NEPA introductory courses that provide guidance on how to prepare these types of environmental documents. For any proposed categorical exclusion called CEs, project involving wetlands, a UMAM or other functional assessment is conducted per state and federal guidelines as appropriate, based on interagency coordination and existing permitting thresholds. Wetland involvement may be identified for projects that do not require EST screening and immediately advance to the design phase. For these projects, provide a summary of wetland impacts, agency coordination, and mitigation as appropriate, as supporting information to the Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist in SWEPT. The appropriate wetland evaluation is included in the project file. Guidance on preparing the Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist is provided in Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E. If a standard permit is required or anticipated, the project may not qualify as a Type 1 CE, depending on the scope of the project. Should the wetland analysis indicate a significant impact to wetlands, the project cannot be processed as a CE. For Type 2 CE projects, documentation must include a concise summary of wetland impacts, agency coordination, the UMAM or other functional assessment, and if applicable, the mitigation standard statement and a wetlands finding. This information should be added to the wetlands section of the Type 2 categorical exclusion determination form in SWEPT. The appropriate wetland evaluation is included in the project file. It is recommended that these documents be placed within the wetlands and other service waters folder within SWEPT. Wetland mitigation should be documented by use of the mitigation standard statement shown here. The wetlands finding must reference EO 11990 and include the rationale used to reach the determination that the proposed project will have no significant short-term or long-term adverse impacts to wetlands. There is no practicable alternative to construction in wetlands, and measures have been taken to minimize harm to wetlands. This finding should be concisely summarized in the wetlands section of the Type 2 categorical exclusion with detailed information contained in the project file in SWEPT. For more information about developing Type 2 CEs, see Part 1, Chapter 5 of the PD&E Manual and NEPA Introductory Course, Categorical Exclusions. The environmental analysis section of an EA or EIS should include a description of the wetland environment within the proposed project alternatives. Wetland documentation should include a description of wetland systems in the project vicinity, such as the size and function of the wetlands. A map should be included to show the relationship of the project to the wetlands identified. Documentation for EA and EIS projects involving new construction in wetlands must contain an evaluation of potential wetland impacts to the level of detail appropriate for the involvement. The results of the wetland evaluation and relevant elements of the NRE, including the UMAM or other functional assessment, are summarized in the wetlands section of the environmental analysis section. An impact discussion must also be included. The wetland impact discussion should identify any wetlands impacted by the proposed project alternatives, including by potential stormwater ponds or other stormwater treatment systems, using the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Classification System and Flux, and discuss the importance of the wetlands impacted by the project alternatives to the surrounding biological community. The discussion should consider the primary functions of the wetlands, such as flood control, wildlife habitat, and groundwater recharge, the relative importance of these functions to the total wetland resources of the area, and any other factors such as uniqueness that may contribute to the wetland's importance. The impact discussion should address each alternative's impact on wetlands, providing the acreage of direct and indirect impacts at each wetland. Wetland functional loss should be evaluated and summarized to document the project's effects on the stability and quality of the wetland short-term and long-term effects on the wetlands, and the significance of any wetland loss on primary functions and values. Avoidance alternatives must be identified and evaluated, and impact minimization measures should be discussed. Maps should be included to show the location of wetlands in relation to each alternative under consideration. EAs and EISs should include a discussion of the conceptual mitigation efforts necessary to compensate for unavoidable impacts to wetlands. Based on the results of the UMAM or other functional assessment, mitigation measures which should be considered include compensatory mitigation pursuant to Section 373.4137 Florida Statute, and as appropriate 33 CFR Section 332. Creation of new wetlands from upland areas, and acquisition of wetlands for preservation, restoration, or enhancement. The impact discussion should also include documentation of agency coordination on the proposed avoidance and minimization activities and conceptual mitigation measures to limit adverse impacts. For EA or EIS projects, a standard statement is used to provide information on the mitigation for the purposes of public information. The standard statement is included in the environmental analysis section. EA and EIS projects include information on the conceptual mitigation plans and add the mitigation standard statement shown here. For more information about developing EISs, see Part 1, Chapter 8 of the PD&E Manual and NEPA Introductory Course Environmental Impact Statement Overview and the Draft Environmental Impact Statement. For more information about developing EAs, see Part 1, Chapter 6 of the PD&E Manual and NEPA Introductory Course Environmental Assessments. When there is no practical alternative to an action which involves new construction in wetlands, the final document must contain the wetlands finding required by EO 11990 and US DOT Order 5660.1A. This may be a FONSI, FEIS, Record of Decision, ROD, or the FEIS. Approval of the FONSI or FEIS containing the wetlands finding will document compliance with the requirements of EO 11990. The finding must include a reference to EO 11990, summarize the basis for the determination that there are no practicable alternatives to the proposed action, summarize the basis of the determination that the proposed action includes all practicable measures to minimize harm to wetlands, and a standard concluding statement. There are two standard concluding statements. The first is for any project that has unavoidable wetland impacts and basically states that there is no practicable alternative to construction in wetlands, and that the project includes practicable measures to minimize harm to wetlands. The second is used for projects that do not impact wetlands and documents that there are no wetland impacts, and Executive Order 11990 does not apply. The wetlands finding statement must be placed in the environmental analysis section of the final environmental document and the executive summary of an FEIS if one is prepared separately from the ROD. Documentation of coordination with applicable agencies such as letters, meetings, and emails should be included in the appendix. For more information about developing FEIS, see Part 1, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual and NEPA Introductory Course, Final Environmental Impact Statement, and Record of Decision. For more information about developing FONSIs, see Part 1, Chapter 7 of the PD&E Manual and NEPA Introductory Course, Findings of No Significant Impact. For non-federal projects documented as State Environmental Impact Reports or SEERs, or non-major state actions, the process should be the same or similar to federal projects in the event that federal funding is needed at a later time or to avoid any unnecessary delay when requesting permits from federal agencies. For SEERs, the result of the wetland evaluation and relevant elements of the NRE, including the UMAM or other functional assessment and potential mitigation options, are summarized in the Wetlands and Other Surface Waters section. Wetland mitigation should be documented by use of the same mitigation standard statement that is used for Type 2 CEs. For more information about developing SEERs, see Part 1, Chapter 10 of the PD&E Manual. In compliance with Executive Order 11990, the FDOT shall provide an opportunity for early public review of any plans or proposals for new construction in wetlands. This opportunity can be through traditional public involvement procedures, including but not limited to public meetings, workshops, flyers, or project websites. For projects requiring a public hearing, the public hearing advertisement must include a statement informing the public of any wetland involvement on a project as described in Part 1, Chapter 11 of the PD&E Manual. In addition, FDOT's public hearing presentation must also mention any wetland involvement for a project in order to increase public awareness of wetland impacts and invite public comment. In 1988, federal agencies including FHWA and the Corps developed a handbook titled Applying the Section 404 Permit Process to Federal Aid Highway Projects, also known as the Red Book. It emphasized how the synchronization of NEPA and other federal regulatory reviews can help expedite project delivery. This handbook was updated in the 2015 Red Book Synchronizing Environmental Reviews for Transportation and Other Infrastructure Projects. This concurrent review by the lead transportation agency and the Corps for projects requiring a standard or individual Section 404 permit can reduce duplication of analysis and allows for joint decision-making resulting in time and cost savings. The NEPA 404 merger expedites project delivery for transportation projects and allows FDOT and the Corps to coordinate common elements under NEPA, as they are required to evaluate alternatives, assess impacts to resources, and balance resource impacts prior to making a NEPA decision. Information gathered during the FDOT's NEPA process is coordinated with the Corps to ensure compliance with both agencies' requirements. For transportation projects requiring a standard individual permit, the Corps may be invited by FDOT to be a cooperating agency for the NEPA document. A NEPA 404 merger may not be warranted for projects requiring a general permit, for example, nationwide or regional general permits, as the consideration of alternatives is not directly applicable to general permits as per 40 CFR Part 230.7. There are 7 common elements which are relevant to both NEPA and Section 404B1 of the Clean Water Act guidelines. 1. Project need. The project need will typically contain capacity information, system linkage, transportation demand, modal interrelationships, safety information, and roadway deficiencies as supporting evidence for the project. 2. Wetlands identification, delineation, and classification. The identification, delineation, and classification will be developed. The Corps Jacksonville District has a process for preparing preliminary jurisdictional determinations. 3. Wetlands impact assessment. The assessment of potential impacts to wetland functions will be developed using the information obtained in the identification and delineation procedure and utilizing UMAM. 4. Alternatives analysis. Each alternative, including no action alternatives, will be analyzed for wetland involvement. 5. Avoidance and minimization analysis. The analysis will document practicable measures considered to avoid and or minimize wetland impacts. The environmental document should clearly indicate the steps taken for avoidance and minimization of impacts in order to eliminate the need to reassess and justify project design during the permitting phase. 6. Conceptual mitigation plan. A conceptual mitigation plan for unavoidable wetland impacts is developed in the PD&E and refined during the permitting process. The conceptual mitigation plan should identify the amount of mitigation necessary to replace the loss of wetland functions as identified by UMAM or other functional assessment. It should also identify mitigation opportunities that FDOT will implement to offset adverse impacts, such as the purchase of mitigation credits from a permitted mitigation bank, payment to FDEP or water management districts for mitigation services, development of its own mitigation site, or any other option that meets state and federal requirements. Appropriate regulatory agency coordination regarding the conceptual mitigation plan is necessary. 7. Coordination. Coordination on the common elements will be documented. Coordination with federal, state, and local regulatory agencies is necessary to the point that the environmental permits are achievable. The NRE, developed during the PD&E study, provides technical information on wetland impact assessment and mitigation analysis, which supports the NEPA decision-making process. It can also provide preliminary information towards satisfying regulatory requirements in accordance with the Section 404(b)(1) guidelines. The NRE, including the UMAM or other functional assessment, will be contained in the project file. Based on the information in the NRE, a wetlands finding is included in the final NEPA document. FDOT is required to obtain authorization for wetland impacts pursuant to state and federal regulatory requirements. Refer to Part 1, Chapter 12 of the PD&E Manual for more information regarding FDOT procedures for obtaining permits and providing wetland mitigation. Change in wetland impacts or mitigation strategies after approval of the environmental document must be documented in reevaluations as per Part 1, Chapter 13 of the PD&E Manual. OEM also offers a computer-based training titled NEPA Introductory Course Reevaluations. For wetlands, reevaluations should document changes in wetland impacts and mitigation strategies, wetland coordination conducted, and the status of environmental permits. Wetland impacts and mitigation established during the PD&E study and/or agency coordination must be addressed through the permitting process. Wetland impact review during design and permit compliance during construction consists of the following. 1. The environmental impact review staff is responsible for reviewing the design plans at each phase to ensure plans are complete and to confirm the project limits and/or scope have not changed in a way which may increase wetland impacts. The district environmental compliance staff, construction, engineering, and inspection, and contractor are responsible for reviewing the final plans to become familiar with the limits of any wetlands on or near the corridor and implementing measures to avoid any unanticipated wetland impacts. 2. During design and permitting, the design and permitting teams should meet with the district environmental staff in the field to review the wetland locations and identify any further measures which could be implemented to further minimize wetland impacts. Prior to construction commencement, the construction team should meet with the district environmental staff and/or the environmental compliance staff to ensure everyone is aware of the limits of the wetlands, the limits of construction, and any necessary precaution necessary to avoid wetland impacts. 3. During the permitting process, the district is responsible for agency coordination. Mitigation should be reviewed specific to wetlands, and coordination should occur with appropriate environmental staff to ensure wetland mitigation is addressed. 4. The district environmental staff will review plans and provide comments on wetlands that were identified and resolutions that should be coordinated with appropriate regulatory agencies or incorporated into the contract documents. 5. They should also review the bid documents to verify that the final design plans are in compliance with PD&E documents and/or permits, and that any necessary specifications regarding wetland protection and mitigation are incorporated, especially in the case of design-build projects. If the design plans are let specifically for permittee responsible mitigation, the bid documents must contain the complete mitigation design, plan, and specifications necessary to complete the mitigation in accordance with the permits. 6. The construction office verifies compliance with permit conditions and commitments during construction. The construction office is also responsible for ensuring that any additional mitigation required as a result of the contractor's design changes or any permit violations during construction is completed. If the project involves permittee responsible mitigation creation, the district must verify that the wetland mitigation is achieved. 7. The construction office, with assistance from the environmental office, must ensure that the wetland mitigation for FDOT built permitting responsible mitigation sites is completed as specified in the contract plans, including modifications approved during construction prior to issuance of final acceptance according to Chapter 12, Section 12.1 of the Construction Project Administration Manual. Permit and mitigation sign-offs is done through a separate process with the regulatory agency. The district should verify regulatory compliance as the project advances. The Office of Environmental Management maintains a central library of training materials as well as documents and publications including manuals, handbooks, guidelines, and agreements. Key references pertinent to this training include the Environmental Management Academy course catalog, which is available in FDOT's Learning Curve, as well as through the OEM PD&E training track. Other resources include FDOT's Project Development and Environmental, or PD&E Manual, State 404 Program Handbook, the Corps' 1987 Wetland Delineation Manual, and the Corps' 2010 Regional Supplement to the Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual, Atlantic and Gulf Coast Plain Region, FDOT's standard specifications for road and bridge construction, and Section 12.1 of the Construction Project Administration Manual.